Everyone, and thank you for your interest in elephant seal communication. So, individually recognizable vocal signals enable many animals, including us, to identify and remember important social partners, maintain key relationships, and adjust their behavior based on prior experience. Recognizing others relies on remembering the unique features of an individual's call and holding those memories over long periods of time. In the social systems where animals may spend significant periods of time apart, remembering who someone is over months or years can directly support survival and reproduction. So in the case of this little Gentoo penguin, he might have a mate that is caring for an egg while he goes out and forages at sea. He must remember the vocal cues associated with his mate and be able to reunite with them when they return after a successful foraging trip, which directly impacts survival. Long-term memory of the acoustic cues has been documented among several species, including dolphins, fur seals, songbirds, and bonobos. However, few studies have really evaluated the role of long-term recognition of acoustic cues in stabilizing dominance hierarchies. One could imagine, though, that being able to recall and remember the identity of a competitive rival would be useful, especially over the long term, as it would reduce the cost of unnecessary conflict, especially if those dominance hierarchies are stable over months or years. The elephant seal is an excellent model to explore the role in long-term vocal recognition in stabilizing dominance relationships. They operate in one of the most competitive breeding systems known among mammals, in which very few males actually attain reproductive success within the species. The males arrive on breeding beaches along the California coast in Mexico in early December and stay till mid-March, a period that lasts about 100 days without access to food or water. During this time, they establish dominance hierarchy that determine access to large groups of estrus females, and only the most dominant males ever retain reproductive status within this system. These dominance relationships are really maintained through the exchange of ritualized displays, which include loud, rhythmic vocalizations that each male produces. Our previous research has demonstrated that the calls of males serve as individual vocal signatures that males learn and remember within breeding seasons. Now, males may have to keep track of acoustically up to 40 competitors within a season, which takes quite a bit of memory. And you can imagine that if you're living in a very stable social hierarchy within a season and you come back to the same site year after year, that this might set the stage for the potential for long-term recognition in this species. So for this work, we wanted to test whether adult male elephant seals retain the memory of the calls of their familiar competitive rivals across years. Now, this work builds upon a long-term research program that we have been leading since 2010. It took a lot of effort to conduct this study. And we conducted this work over successive seasons throughout the study period. So in year one, over the course of the duration of this work, we would observe the dominance hierarchies of males and then record the calls of known individuals within the system. So, for example, 205 males were tracked between 2010 and 2023. However, 31 males were selected as potential targets to receive playback treatments the following year. And this was based off of our observations of social dynamics at this breeding site. So once we had identified these individuals, we would record the calls of their most familiar dominant and subordinate rivals. Additionally, we recorded the calls of unfamiliar adult males from distant breeding colonies to use as a control. The following year, we would hope to reacquire those same males and conduct playback experiments of their known familiar and subordinate rivals from the previous year. However, of these 31 males that we had selected, only 10 returned the following year across this study period. Each received 2 playback treatments. All 10 males were exposed to dominant rival calls, 4 out of 10 were exposed to familiar subordinates, and 6 out of 10 received the controlled treatment. Based on our previous published research, we expected differential responses based on the calling status of the playback. The reactions to the playbacks that we expected would be for the target animal, to avoid the speaker when exposed to the call of a dominant rival, aggress the speaker when it was its subordinate, and exhibit no response to an unfamiliar male. So in summary, our results were really suggestive that males exhibit rapid postural changes and a tendency to retreat from familiar dominant rivals, while they often approach familiar subordinates, even after 1 year of separation. Many males hesitated before responding to unfamiliar adult males. And this is suggestive that males may remember their rivals from previous years. However, it's important to note that these responses are quite subtle in comparison to the playbacks that we have conducted, testing with in-season recognition. So, in summary, males are really operating within this complex social system in which familiar individuals return to the same breeding beaches year after year. The ability to remember the dominant status of males from previous year may be a helpful tool for males when attempting to attain breeding status at the beginning of each season. However, it's important to note that just because males might remember their rivals at the beginning of the season doesn't necessarily mean that their dominant status carries over and ultimately predicts the hierarchy that year. Other variables might be important, like time of arrival, aggressiveness, and also their foraging success. And so this is very similar to when you think about college football, where you may have an end of season ranking of a specific team. And then think about at the beginning of the next year, that ranking might influence your perception of that team. And you might remember that team's ranking, but that doesn't ultimately dictate what happens in that season. In summary, for this work, males showed the ability to remember the calls of familiar opponents from previous seasons, demonstrating long-term memory in this species.
All right. Thank you so much, Carolyn. I'm going to spotlight you for some questions and answers. So I'll have, first off, thank you. And then second off, I'll have Wendy read off some of these questions.
There we go. All right. Yeah, we have a few questions in the Q&A. I'll start off with one from Lara. Uh, Lara's asking, is there no visual component whatsoever to recognition between males?
That's an excellent question, Lara. Thanks for asking that. These are actually multimodal displays. So in addition to the acoustic component, there is a visual component as well as a vibrational cue that's emitted by each male. For the purposes of this research, we tried to isolate the acoustic features of the call, but certainly they are also attending to other signaling that males are using that are visual and vibrational.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. Next up is from Avery. How do you determine the relative status of a particular pair of males?
Yes, I wish I had. Originally, I sent a video that was way too long, and I had to cut everything down. But this is a fun bit of the story. So we observed dyadic interactions between competing males. We have hundreds of hours of observations where we're looking out at the colony of animals that we know and have identified. And every time we see two males facing off towards one another, and there's an interaction that's happening. We note the apparent winner of that interaction, the loser, whether or not they vocalize, the intensity of that interaction. And then all of that behavioral data is fed into an ELO ranking system, which was originally developed for two-player games like chess. And it effectively assigns a quantitative score to each individual in our study based on the relative probability of one individual beating another. So at the very beginning of the season, everybody has the same score, and then it's adjusted based on these interactions that we observe. So we have an instantaneous score of dominance, but also an end of season score of dominance that we can use.
That is so cool. Thank you for sharing that. And one more question in the Q&A for now, from George. The question is, are elephant seal calls identifiers or do they serve another purpose?
Yes, so we've conducted work on the species for many years, and some of our previous research has demonstrated that the calls of adult male elephant seals serve effectively as individual vocal signatures. And so each male has a very distinctive, different call from that of his rival, and they're able to keep track of and remember those calls during the breeding season. And we know specifically through playback experiments that those calls are learned. So there's nothing inherent about the differences in the call that, for example, convey dominant status or size. It's really effectively a name like George or Sam or Wendy that is associated with that individual, and it's stable within a season and between years. And we know that when animals are young, similar to birdsong, they're highly variable in terms of these signals that they produce. And then as they get older, they become stabilized. We know what features of the call convey identity information, and it's specifically the rhythmic features. They're basically like drum beats that they're emitting that have different patterns. And so males are able to attend to those drum beat patterns and make decisions based on who they're associated with.